The stars were burning above Thesson Prime. Great ships hung in the black sky like angry gods, their weapons painting lines of fire across the heavens. Below them, a world was dying. Ambassador Kethrall pressed his thin fingers against the communication panel. His hands were shaking. His compound eyes, usually bright with the golden light of his species, had grown dim with exhaustion. He had not slept in 3 rotations. None of the Valari had slept. Sleep meant death now. The Terran Dominion had come without warning. Their warships had appeared at the edge of the system like a swarm of metal insects, and then the killing had begun. The Valari were not warriors. They had never been warriors. For 10,000 years, they had collected knowledge, preserved history, and believed that wisdom alone could protect them from the darkness between stars. They had been fools. Kethrall activated the emergency frequency. It was a channel reserved for the worst moments, a cry into the void that any species in the galactic concord could hear. But he knew the truth. No one would answer. The Concord was built on fear and self-interest. Every species looked after itself. That was the way of things. Still, he had to try. "This is Ambassador Kethrall of Thesson Prime," he said, his voice thin and tired. "We are under attack. The Terran Dominion is destroying our cities. Our people are dying. We have no weapons. We have no fleet. We are asking anyone who hears this message to help us. Please, we cannot survive alone." He sent the message and waited. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Outside his shelter, he could hear the distant thunder of explosions. Another city falling. Another million lives ending. Kethrall closed his eyes and prepared to die. Far across the galaxy, the message traveled through space at the speed of light. It passed dead moons and empty systems. It slipped through the borders of civilizations that heard it and chose to look away. It was just another cry for help in a universe full of suffering. No one cared about the Valari. No one was coming. But the message did not stop. It kept moving, kept searching until it reached a small ship at the edge of colonized space. The TMS Defiance was not a famous vessel. It was a standard battlecruiser of the Terran Marine Corps carrying 300 soldiers on a routine patrol. Its mission was simple: watch the border, report any threats, and avoid trouble. Earth was still new to the galactic stage. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. They were not members of the Concord. They were outsiders, strangers, a young species that the older civilizations viewed with suspicion and mild contempt. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was on communication duty when the distress signal came through. He was a tall man with tired eyes and a scar on his jaw from a training accident years ago. He had joined the Marines because he wanted to see the stars. So far, he had mostly seen the inside of ship corridors. The message played through his headset, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. The voice was alien. The language translated by the ship's computer. But the fear was universal. He knew that sound. It was the sound of someone who had given up hope. He brought the message to Captain Amy Lawson. Lawson was in her quarters reviewing supply reports. She was a small woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and a face that rarely showed emotion. She had commanded the Defiance for 6 years. In that time, she had learned that the universe was neither fair nor kind. She had learned to make hard choices. She listened to the message twice. "Where is Thesson Prime?" she asked. 12 hours away at maximum speed," Morrison replied. "It's outside conquered territory. Technically, it's outside everyone's territory." "The Terran Dominion," Lawson said quietly. "I know that name. They've conquered over 100 worlds." "Yes, ma'am." Lawson was silent for a long moment. Morrison watched her face, trying to read her thoughts. He could not. "If we go," she said slowly, "we will be violating our orders. Earth Command wants us to avoid conflict with the Concord powers. The Corran Dominion is one of the largest military forces in this part of the galaxy. We have one ship, 300 Marines. We would be risking everything." "Yes, ma'am," Morrison said again. "And if we don't go, those people die." Morrison did not answer. He did not need to. Lawson stood up. She walked to the small window of her quarters and looked out at the stars. They seemed very far away, very cold. She thought about the rules she would be breaking. She thought about the reports she would have to file, the explanations she would have to give. She thought about the war that might follow if things went wrong. Then she thought about the voice on that recording. The fear, the hope that someone, somewhere, might care enough to answer. "Set a course for Thesson Prime," she said. "Maximum speed." Morrison felt his heart beat faster. "Ma'am, are you sure?" Lawson turned to face him. There was something in her eyes that he had never seen before. It might have been anger. It might have been determination. It might have been something older and deeper than both. "Those people asked for help," she said. "I don't know anything about their world. I don't know anything about their culture. But I know what it means to be afraid and alone. And I know that we have the power to do something about it." She paused. "The universe is full of species that look away when others suffer. Maybe that's smart. Maybe that's safe. But that's not who we are. That's not what humans do." Morrison saluted. "I'll inform the crew." He left the captain's quarters and walked through the corridors of the Defiance. Around him, the ship hummed with quiet energy. Soldiers sat in the mess hall, playing cards and telling jokes. Engineers checked systems and wrote reports. None of them knew yet that their lives were about to change. Morrison reached the bridge and gave the order. The Defiance turned toward Thesson Prime and began to move. Behind them, the safe and familiar patrol route fell away into darkness. Ahead, a world was dying, and 300 humans were coming to save it. In the ruins of his shelter, Ambassador Kethral heard the communication panel beep. A message had come through. He opened it with trembling fingers, expecting nothing, hoping for everything. The message was short. It came from a species he had never heard of, a world called Earth, a ship called Defiance. It said only, "We are coming. Hold on." Kethral stared at the words for a long time. Then, for the first time in 3 rotations, he allowed himself to hope. The TMS Defiance dropped out of hyperspace into chaos. Thesson Prime filled the view screen, a beautiful world of blue oceans and silver continents, now scarred with the black marks of orbital bombardment. Above it, the Corran war fleet hung like a crown of thorns. 12 dreadnoughts. 40 cruisers. More fighters than anyone could count. Captain Amy Lawson looked at the enemy fleet and felt her stomach tighten. She had known it would be bad. She had not known it would be this bad. "All hands to battle stations," she said calmly. "Lieutenant Morrison, get the Marines ready for ground deployment." "We're going in." The Defiance was built for speed, not firepower. It could not defeat the Corran fleet in open combat. But it could do something else. It could run straight through. Lawson ordered full thrust toward the planet. The Corran ships, surprised by the sudden appearance of an unknown vessel, were slow to react. By the time their weapons locked on, the Defiance was already through their outer line. Plasma fire raked the ship's hull. Alarms screamed through the corridors, but the Defiance kept moving, punching through the chaos like a fist through smoke. It reached the upper atmosphere of Thesson Prime and began its descent. Below, the capital city was burning. Sergeant Danny Vance stood in the cargo bay with 40 Marines. They were packed into drop pods. each one a small metal coffin designed to deliver soldiers to the ground at terrifying speeds. Danny had done this before. He had trained for it 100 times, but training was not the same as reality. The green light flashed. The pods launched. Danny felt his body pressed against the seat as gravity grabbed him and pulled him down. Through the tiny window of his pod, he could see fire and smoke and the distant shapes of enemy ships. Then, the ground was rushing up to meet him, and there was no more time to think. The pod hit the surface hard. The door blew open. Danny was on his feet and moving before the dust settled. The landing zone was a nightmare. Buildings had been reduced to rubble. Fires burned everywhere. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of something chemical and wrong. And through the smoke, Danny could see them. The Terran soldiers. They were massive creatures, nearly 3 meters tall, with thick-scaled skin and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. They wore heavy armor and carried weapons that looked like they could cut through steel. They moved with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. Danny raised his rifle and fired. The first Terran soldier fell, then another. Around Danny, the other Marines emerged from their pods and joined the fight. Corporal Megan Torres set up a defensive position behind a collapsed wall and began coordinating movements through her radio. Private Kyle Bennett advanced through the rubble, laying down covering fire that forced the enemy to take cover. The Terran soldiers were shocked. They had expected the soft pink creatures to run or surrender. Every other species they had conquered had done so, but these humans did not run. They pushed forward. Danny led his squad through the burning streets. They moved from building to building, clearing rooms and rescuing survivors. The Valari, they found, were strange to look at. They were tall and thin, with bodies like insects and large golden eyes. They trembled when the Marines approached, waiting for death. Instead, the Marines offered them water and pointed them toward the evacuation zone. An old Valari grabbed Danny's arm as he passed. The creature's eyes were wet with something that might have been tears. "Why?" the Valari asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you come?" Danny did not have time for a long answer. The battle was still raging around them. Plasma bolts cracked through the air. Somewhere nearby, a building collapsed with a roar of breaking stone. "Because you asked," Danny said simply. Then he moved on. The fighting grew worse as the Marines pushed deeper into the city. The Terran soldiers had recovered from their initial surprise. They began to fight back with savage efficiency. They were strong and well-armed, and they did not fear death. But neither did the Marines. Corporal Torres took a plasma bolt to the shoulder while dragging a wounded Valari child to safety. The blast burned through her armor and took her left arm below the elbow. She screamed once, then gritted her teeth and kept moving. She got the child to the medics before she allowed herself to collapse. Private Bennett found himself surrounded in a narrow alley. 3 Terran soldiers closed in on him from both ends. He had 12 rounds left in his rifle. He used 11 to kill the first 2. Then he drew his combat knife and charged the third. The fight lasted 30 seconds. Bennett won. Lieutenant Morrison led the second wave of Marines from the Defiance. They landed in the central plaza, right in front of the Archive of Ages, the great library that held the collected knowledge of the Valari people. The Terran soldiers were trying to burn it down. Morrison was determined to stop them. The battle for the archive lasted 3 hours. 40 Marines against 200 Terran soldiers. The humans used every trick they knew. They set traps and ambushes. They used the rubble for cover. They fought in teams, covering each other, never leaving a wounded soldier behind. When it was over, the archive still stood. 60 Terran soldiers were dead. 12 Marines had been killed. Morrison stood among the bodies and felt the weight of what they had done. He looked up at the sky, where the Defiance was still fighting its desperate battle against the enemy fleet. He could see flashes of light as weapons fired. He could see his ship dying piece by piece, but it was still fighting, and so were they. Ambassador Kethral found Morrison at sunset. The ambassador was wounded, his arm wrapped in bloody bandages, but his eyes were bright. "I did not believe you would come," Kethral said. "No one has ever answered our calls before. No one has ever risked themselves for us." Morrison looked at the alien diplomat. He thought about all the things he could say, about duty and honor and the values his country had taught him, about the simple fact that sometimes you have to stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. In the end, he said nothing. He just nodded. The battle for Thesson Prime was not over. The Corin fleet was still in orbit. More enemy soldiers were coming. The Marines were tired and wounded and running low on ammunition, but they were still fighting. And somewhere up above, through the smoke and fire, the Defiance was still flying. Captain Lawson was still giving orders. The guns were still firing. Hope was still alive. The TMS Defiance was dying. Captain Amy Lawson knew it. Everyone on the bridge knew it. The ship had taken 17 direct hits in the past 6 hours. Half the decks were sealed off due to hull breaches. The engines were failing. The weapons systems were running on backup power. But the ship was still fighting. Lawson stood at the command console, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. Sparks flew from damaged panels. The lights flickered on and off. Through the view screen, she could see the Corin dreadnoughts closing in, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. "Status report," she said. Her first officer, Commander Ben Harper, checked his console. His face was pale. "Engines at 20%. Shields are gone. We have maybe 30 minutes before they finish us." Lawson nodded slowly. 30 minutes. It was not enough time. The Marines on the ground needed more. They needed hours, maybe days. The Defiance could not give them that. But maybe it could give them something else. "All non-essential personnel to the escape pods," Lawson ordered. "Everyone who doesn't need to be here, get off this ship." Harper stared at her. "Captain, if we evacuate now—" "The ship stays," Lawson interrupted. "I stay. But there's no reason for everyone to die here. Get the wounded off. Get the engineers off. Let them take their chances on the surface." Harper wanted to argue. Lawson could see it in his eyes. But he was a good officer. He followed orders. The escape pods launched into the fire-streaked sky. Some of them made it to the surface. Some did not. Lawson watched them go and said a silent prayer for each one. Then she turned back to the battle. The Defiance had one thing left to give. Its guns were still operational, its missiles were still loaded, and its crew, the 40 sailors who had chosen to stay, were ready to fight to the end. "Target the lead dreadnought," Lawson said. "Everything we have. Make it hurt." The ship screamed forward. Its weapons blazed. Missiles struck the massive Corin vessel, tearing holes in its armor. The dreadnought's shields flickered and died. A chain of explosions ripped through its hull. The Corin flagship was crippled. It would not fight again. But the cost was high. The counterattack shattered what remained of the Defiance. The engines failed completely. The ship began to fall, pulled down by the planet's gravity. "It was an honor serving with you," Lawson said quietly. The Defiance hit the atmosphere and began to burn. On the ground, the Marines saw their ship fall. They saw the streak of fire cross the sky. They heard the distant thunder of the crash. Lieutenant Jake Morrison felt something cold settle in his heart. He had served under Captain Lawson for 3 years. She had been his mentor, his commander, his friend, and now she was gone. But there was no time to grieve. The Corin soldiers were attacking again. The enemy had learned from their first battles. They no longer underestimated the humans. They came in waves now, hundreds of soldiers at a time, supported by heavy weapons and armored vehicles. The Marines were pushed back, step by bloody step. Sergeant Danny Vance held the line at the northern gate. His squad had started with 40 soldiers. Now there were 18. They were running low on ammunition. They were running low on hope. But they kept fighting. "Hold this position," Danny ordered. "No matter what happens, we hold this position." A young private named Scott Miller looked at him with frightened eyes. He was barely 20 years old. He had never seen real combat before today. Now he had killed more enemies than he could count. "Sergeant," Miller said, his voice shaking, "are we going to die here?" Danny looked at the young man. He thought about lying, about offering false comfort. But soldiers deserved the truth. "Maybe," he said, "but if we die protecting people who needed us. That's worth something." Miller nodded slowly. Then he checked his rifle and turned back to face the enemy. Corporal Megan Torres had lost her arm, but she had not lost her fight. She coordinated the defense from a makeshift command post, using her one remaining hand to operate the radio. She directed squads to where they were needed most. She called in airstrikes from the few remaining shuttles. She refused to stop. Ambassador Kethrall stayed with her. The Valari diplomat had no military training. He could not fight, but he could help with the wounded. He could carry messages. He could do something. "Your people are dying for us," Kethrall said during a brief pause in the fighting. "I do not understand why." Torres looked at him with tired eyes. "Because it's what we do." "But we are strangers to you. We have nothing to offer. We cannot repay this debt." Torres shook her head. "It's not about debt. It's not about payment. It's about doing what's right." Kethrall was silent for a long moment. In his long life, he had studied 1,000 civilizations. He had read the histories of 100 worlds. He had never encountered anything like these humans. "Your species is very young," he said finally. "But I think you may be the most remarkable people I have ever known." Torres smiled despite her pain. "Tell that to my mom. She always said I was trouble." The night came slowly. The fighting continued in the darkness. The Marines fought with night vision and thermal sensors. The Terran soldiers fought with brute strength and numbers. By midnight, the human lines had been pushed back to the archive of ages. The great library stood behind them, filled with the knowledge of 10,000 years. In front of them, an army of enemies gathered for the final assault. Lieutenant Morrison looked at his remaining soldiers. There were fewer than 100 now. They were exhausted, wounded, and afraid. But they were still standing. "Whatever happens tonight," Morrison said, "I want you all to know that I'm proud of you. Every single one of you. We came here to save these people. We did that. Whatever happens next, that matters." The soldiers nodded. Some of them prayed. Some of them wrote final messages to loved ones on Earth. Some of them simply stood in silence, waiting for the end. The Terran army began to move, and then, through the clouds above, new stars appeared. Ships, human ships, a fleet of them, dropping out of hyperspace with weapons blazing. The cavalry had arrived. Admiral Chris Dunham stood on the bridge of the TMS Resolute and watched the Terran fleet scatter before him. He had brought 12 ships through hyperspace, violating 6 treaties and a direct order from Earth Command. He had risked his career, his freedom, and possibly his life. He did not regret it for a single second. "All ships, target the enemy dreadnoughts," he ordered. "Clear a path to the surface. Our people are down there, and we're bringing them home." The Terran fleet attacked with fury. The Resolute and its sister ship, The TMS Valor led the assault. Their weapons tore through Corran shields like paper. Missile swarms filled the void between ships. Explosions bloomed in the darkness of space. The Corran commanders had not expected this. They had not expected humans to send reinforcements. They had not expected humans to fight so hard for a world that was not their own. The galaxy's rules said that species looked after themselves. Humans were supposed to be weak, divided, primitive. They were wrong. On the surface, the Marines watched the sky light up with hope. Staff Sergeant Laura Kim led her squad through the burning streets, pushing toward the front lines. They were part of the reinforcement force. Fresh soldiers dropped from the new ships. Kim was a small woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She had served in the Marines for 15 years. She had seen battles on a dozen worlds. But she had never seen anything like this. The city was a wasteland. Buildings lay in ruins. Fires burned everywhere. The ground was covered with debris and bodies, and through the smoke, she could see the surviving defenders. They were tired, wounded, and barely standing. But they were still fighting. "First wave on me," Kim ordered. "We're pushing through to the archive. Move fast, stay low, and don't stop for anything." Her squad moved like shadows through the wreckage. They had trained for urban combat. They knew how to use cover, how to advance under fire, how to work as a team. Within minutes, they had linked up with Lieutenant Morrison's forces. Morrison looked like he had not slept in days. His uniform was torn and stained with blood. His eyes were red with exhaustion. But when he saw the reinforcements, he smiled. "Staff Sergeant Kim," he said, "you have no idea how glad I am to see you." Kim saluted. "The Admiral sends his regards, sir. He says to hold the line. We're taking this planet back." The counterattack began at dawn. Thousands of fresh Marines poured out of the landing zones, supported by tanks, artillery, and close air support. The Corran soldiers, who had been on the edge of victory, suddenly found themselves surrounded. Sergeant Danny Vance led his remaining squad in the assault on the enemy command post. They had lost so many people in the past few days. Friends, brothers, sisters. But they were still moving forward. Private Scott Miller was at Danny's side. The young man had changed since the battle began. The fear was still there, but so was something else. Determination, purpose. He had seen the worst the universe could offer, and he had not broken. "Sergeant," Miller said as they approached the enemy position, "do you think we'll make it?" Danny looked at him. "We've made it this far, haven't we?" They hit the command post hard and fast. The Corran soldiers inside fought back with desperate fury, but they were outnumbered now. The humans flowed through the building like water, clearing room after room. Danny found the enemy commander in the central chamber. Warlord Thesic was a massive creature, even by Corran standards. He stood nearly 4 meters tall, his scales scarred from 100 battles. In his hands, he held a massive blade that glowed with energy. "Human!" Thesic growled. "You have caused me much trouble." Danny raised his rifle. That was the plan. They fought in the ruins of the command post. Danny was smaller, weaker, and slower. But he was also clever. He used the debris for cover. He used his agility to dodge the massive blade. He waited for his moment. When it came, he did not hesitate. The rifle shot took Thesic in the throat. The warlord stumbled, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to speak, but no words came. Then he fell, his massive body crashing to the ground. Danny stood over the body of the enemy commander and felt nothing but exhaustion. In orbit, the battle was ending. The Corran fleet was in full retreat. Admiral Dunham had lost 4 ships, but he had destroyed or disabled 30 enemy vessels. The survivors were running for the edge of the system, their dreams of conquest shattered. Dunham allowed himself a small smile. Then he opened a channel to the surviving Marines on the ground. "This is Admiral Dunham," he said. "The enemy fleet has been defeated. Thesson Prime is secure. You did good work down there. All of you." On the surface, the Marines heard the message and cheered. Some of them laughed. Some of them cried. Some of them simply sat down and stared at the sky, unable to believe that they had survived. Corporal Megan Torres sat in the medical tent, waiting for the doctors to look at what remained of her arm. Ambassador Kethrall was beside her. "We won," Torres said quietly. Kethrall nodded. "Because of you. Because of your people. You came when no one else would. You fought when everyone told you to walk away. You bled for strangers." Torres looked at the Valari diplomat. She thought about all the things she had lost in this battle: her arm, her friends, her sense of safety. But she also thought about what they had saved: a world, a people, a future. "It was worth it," she said. The sun rose over Thesson Prime. The fires were still burning, but they were smaller now. The guns were silent. The smoke was beginning to clear. In the ruins of the capital, humans and Valari worked side by side, pulling survivors from the rubble. They did not speak the same language. They did not share the same biology. But they understood each other. They understood that something remarkable had happened here. The universe had learned a new word today. A word that would spread across 1,000 worlds, whispered in fear by some and hope by others. The word was human, and it meant something different now. The Galactic Concord met on the station of Nexus Prime, a massive structure that floated between the stars. Representatives from 100 worlds gathered in the Great Chamber, their bodies and faces as different as the planets they came from. Some were tall and thin, some were short and round, some had scales, some had feathers, some had no solid form at all. They had come to discuss the matter of Earth. Ambassador Kethrall stood before the assembly. He had recovered from his wounds, though he still walked with a slight limp. His golden eyes swept across the gathered delegates, seeing the fear and suspicion in many of their faces. "I know what you are thinking," he began. "You are thinking that humanity is dangerous. You are thinking that they have violated our treaties, ignored our rules, and interfered in matters that did not concern them. You are thinking that they must be punished." The chamber was silent. Many of the delegates nodded. "I am here to tell you that you are wrong." Kethrall pressed a button on his podium. Images appeared in the air above him, images of burning cities, images of dying Valari, images of human soldiers fighting and bleeding and dying for people they had never met. "The Corran Dominion attacked my world without warning," Kethrall said. "They killed millions of my people. They burned our cities. They tried to destroy our history. And when we called for help, when we begged the Concord for assistance, what did you do?" He paused. "Nothing. You did nothing. You were too afraid, too concerned with your own safety, too worried about offending the Dominion. You left us to die." The delegates shifted uncomfortably. Some of them looked away. "But someone answered," Kethrall continued. "Humanity answered. They sent one ship, 300 soldiers, to face an empire that had conquered 100 worlds. They knew they could not win. They knew they would probably die. They came anyway." He let that sink in. 12 of their soldiers died defending my planet's archive. A building full of old books and ancient records. Knowledge that meant nothing to them. They died protecting it because it meant something to us. Their captain crashed her ship into an enemy dreadnought to buy time for her people on the ground. She was willing to sacrifice everything, not for glory or profit, but because we asked for help. Kethral's voice grew stronger. This is the species you want to punish. This is the species you fear. I say we should be grateful. I say we should learn from them. I say we should be ashamed that they had to teach us what it means to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. The chamber erupted in argument. Some delegates shouted in anger. Others called for calm. The debate raged for hours. In the end, humanity was not punished. They were invited to join the Galactic Concord as full members. The vote was close, but Kethral's speech had changed many minds. The universe was watching. On Earth, Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood before a crowd of reporters. He had been called home to receive a medal and answer questions. He did not enjoy either task. "Lieutenant Morrison," a reporter called out, "why did you and your fellow Marines risk your lives for an alien species you had never met?" Morrison thought about the question. He thought about the burning cities and the terrified Velari. He thought about Captain Lawson and all the soldiers who had died. He thought about the look in Ambassador Kethral's eyes when the first human ships appeared. "Because they asked for help," he said simply. "That was enough," the reporter pressed on. "But the risks were enormous. You could have all been killed. Earth could have been drawn into a war with a much more powerful enemy. Was it really worth it?" Morrison looked at the reporter for a long moment. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," he said. "Stories about people who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. Even when it was dangerous. She said that's what makes us human. Not our DNA, not our planet, but our choice to help each other." He paused. "I think she was right." Corporal Megan Torres returned to Earth with a prosthetic arm and a chest full of medals. She did not wear the medals. She kept them in a drawer and tried not to think about them too much. The doctor said her new arm was better than the original, stronger, more precise. Torres did not care. She missed the weight of her real arm. She missed the feeling of skin against skin when she held someone's hand. But she was alive. So many of her friends were not. She visited the families of the soldiers who had died. She told them stories about their sons and daughters, their husbands and wives. She told them about the bravery she had witnessed. She told them that their loved ones had died as heroes. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was all she could offer. Private Kyle Bennett went home to a small town in Montana. He brought a Velari child with him. The girl's name was impossible for human mouths to pronounce, so Bennett called her Lily. She had lost her entire family in the attack. She had no one left. Now she had him. The people in town stared at first. They had never seen an alien before. But Bennett's mother welcomed Lily into her home without hesitation. She said, family was family, no matter what planet you came from. Captain Amy Lawson was found in the wreckage of the Defiance 3 days after the battle. She was alive, barely, protected by a section of hull that had shielded her from the worst of the crash. The doctors said it was a miracle. Lawson said it was luck. She was court-martialed for disobeying orders. The trial lasted 2 days. The prosecution presented evidence that she had violated regulations, risked her crew, and nearly started an interstellar war. The defense called Ambassador Kethral as a witness. He testified for 4 hours. When he was finished, the judges had tears in their eyes. Lawson was acquitted of all charges. A week later, she was promoted to admiral. The Corps and Dominion signed a peace treaty for the first time in 800 years. They had learned something about humans, something that made them cautious. Across the galaxy, species who had lived in fear began to hope. They whispered stories about the strange creatures from the small blue planet. They talked about soldiers who did not run, who fought for strangers, who answered calls for help that no one else would answer. They talked about humanity. And in the great archive of ages on Thesson Prime, the Valari scholars added a new section to their records. It was small, just a few pages, compared to the thousands of years of history that surrounded it. But it was important. It was the story of how aliens shouted for aid, and Terran Marines emerged out of the smoke.